The hallways of Westbrook Conservatory gleamed under the soft evening lights. Most of the students and teachers had gone home, leaving behind the lingering echoes of that day's music lessons. The only person still moving through the building was a small woman in her early 40s. Her work uniform slightly too large for her frame. Lin Wei pushed her cleaning cart down the empty corridor, humming softly to herself. She had been working as a custodian at the prestigious music school for nearly 3 years now. Every evening she would make her rounds, dusting the trophy cases, mopping the floors, and making sure everything was spotless for the next day's lessons. Tonight was no different as she made her way to the main concert hall. This was always her favorite part of the building to clean. Unlike the practice rooms with their upright pianos, the concert hall housed a magnificent grand piano that gleamed under the stage lights. Lin took extra care when cleaning this room, moving delicately around the instrument as if it were made of glass. She had just finished polishing the wooden floors when she paused, looking at the beautiful piano sitting center stage. The lid was propped open, ready for tomorrow's masterclass with the famous Professor Theodore Bennett. Lin had seen him many times during her evening shifts, though he had never once acknowledged her presence. He was known throughout the conservatory for his brilliant musical mind and equally harsh teaching methods. Lin set down her cleaning cloth and glanced at her watch. She still had 30 minutes before she needed to move on to the next section of the building. The conservatory was empty. Nobody would know. With hesitant steps, she approached the grand piano. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she carefully sat on the bench, making sure her uniform wouldn't leave any marks. For a long moment, she simply sat there, her rough, work-worn hands hovering over the pristine white keys. Just once, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the empty hall. Lin placed her fingers on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then, with gentle pressure, she played a single note. The clear, pure sound filled the concert hall, vibrating through the air before slowly fading away. A small smile crossed her face. She began to play more notes, simple scales at first. Her movements were cautious and measured, as if she were afraid the piano might shatter under her touch. But as the minutes passed, something changed. Her posture straightened, her fingers moved with growing confidence, and the music transformed from hesitant scales into the beginnings of a melody. Lin's face softened as she played, the worry lines around her eyes smoothing out. The stress of the long day of bills to pay and the constant struggle to make ends meet seemed to melt away with each note. She didn't notice how her simple melody had evolved into something more complex, her fingers dancing across the keys with surprising skill. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the heavy door to the concert hall swing open. Professor Bennett had been halfway home when he realized he'd left his leather briefcase in the concert hall. It contained important sheet music for tomorrow's masterclass, along with student evaluations he needed to complete that night. With an irritated sigh, he had turned his car around and driven back to the conservatory. He expected to find the hall dark and empty. Instead, as he approached the doors, he heard music. Not the polished performance of one of his advanced students, but something different, something raw yet strangely compelling. Theodore pushed the door open silently, his tall frame casting a long shadow from the hallway light. His eyes narrowed when he saw the small figure at his piano. He recognized her immediately as one of the cleaning staff, though he had never bothered to learn her name. What he couldn't understand was what he was hearing. The woman was playing a piece he recognized, the beginning of Debussy's Clair de Lune, but with small, intuitive variations that showed a natural understanding of the music's emotional core. Her technique was clearly untrained, with improper hand positioning and posture that would make any proper teacher cringe, and yet there was something in her playing that caught his attention. A raw talent, unpolished but undeniable. For a full minute he stood frozen in the doorway, his irritation giving way to confusion, then curiosity. The woman's eyes remained closed, completely absorbed in the music flowing from her fingers. Theodore's expert ear caught every technical mistake, but also recognized something many of his technically perfect students lacked: genuine emotion. Finally, he cleared his throat loudly. Lin's hands crashed down on the keys in shock, creating a jarring discord that echoed through the hall. She jumped up from the bench so quickly she nearly fell backward, her face draining of color when she saw who was standing at the door. "I'm so sorry, sir," she gasped, backing away from the piano as if it had suddenly burst into flames. I didn't mean to. I finished cleaning and I thought, you thought you would help yourself to a $500,000 instrument? Professor Bennett's voice was cool and measured as he walked toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the now silent hall. This is not a toy for the cleaning staff to play with when they're bored. Lynn's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She clutched her cleaning cloth like a shield. It won't happen again, sir. Please don't tell the management. I need this job. Theodore reached the piano and ran his fingers along its surface, checking for fingerprints or damage, though he knew he would find none. The woman was clearly terrified, her eyes darting to the door as if calculating her escape route. How long have you been playing? He asked suddenly, catching her off guard. Lynn blinked in surprise. I don't play, sir. Not really. Don't lie to me, he said, his voice sharp. That was Debussy you were attempting. Where did you learn it? She looked down at her worn shoes. I've never had lessons, if that's what you're asking. I just listen. When the students practice, I listen while I clean. And sometimes I remember the songs. Theodore's eyebrows rose slightly. You're playing by ear? All of it? Lynn nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Music has always made sense to me, like a language I somehow understand without being taught. She glanced up briefly, then away again. I'm sorry for touching the piano. It was disrespectful. The professor stood silent for a moment, studying the small woman before him. Her uniform hung loose on her thin frame, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. Nothing about her appearance suggested musical talent or artistic temperament. And yet, sit, he commanded, gesturing to the piano bench. Lynn's eyes widened in alarm. Sir? Sit down, he repeated, moving to stand beside the piano. Play something else you've heard. Anything. Her hands trembled slightly as she slowly returned to the bench, perching on its edge as if ready to flee at any moment. I don't remember much, she said quietly. Just pieces. Play, Theodore insisted. With a deep breath, Lynn placed her hands on the keys again. After a moment's hesitation, she began to play. This time, it was a fragment of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the haunting first movement that often floated from the practice rooms in the evenings. Her playing was imperfect, with occasional wrong notes and uneven timing, but the soul of the piece remained intact. Professor Bennett watched her hands, noting their strength from years of manual labor, yet surprised by their unexpected dexterity. He observed how she instinctively found the correct keys despite clearly having no formal training. Most strikingly, he noticed how her face transformed as she played, the worried expression giving way to something approaching peace. When she finished, Lynn quickly pulled her hands away from the piano and stood up. I should finish my work now, she said, moving to retrieve her abandoned cleaning cart. Wait, Theodore's voice stopped her. What's your name? She turned back, surprised by the question. Lin Wei, sir. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Ms. Wei, what you're doing is completely unacceptable. This instrument is for students and faculty only. Lin's shoulders slumped. Yes, sir. It won't happen again. However, he continued, I'm conducting a special master class tomorrow afternoon. Advanced students, a few visiting musicians. He paused, an idea forming in his mind. Be in this hall at 3 o'clock sharp. Lin looked confused. For cleaning, sir? I don't usually start until 5. A thin smile crossed Theodore's face. Not for cleaning. I think my students could benefit from a different kind of lesson tomorrow. Without explaining further, he walked to the side of the stage, retrieved his forgotten briefcase, and headed toward the door. He stopped at the threshold and turned back. Lin still stood by the piano, looking bewildered. 3 o'clock, he repeated. Don't be late. As the door closed behind him, Lin stared at the empty space where he had been, her mind racing with questions and a growing sense of dread. What exactly did the stern professor have planned, and why did she feel like her secret evening moments with the piano had just set something life-changing in motion? Lin barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Professor Bennett's stern face and heard his puzzling command. 3 o'clock. Don't be late. What could he possibly want with her? She had spent the rest of her shift jumping at every small sound, convinced she would be called to the management office and fired on the spot. By morning, anxiety had settled in her stomach like a cold stone. She went through her daily routine mechanically, preparing a simple breakfast for herself, catching the early bus to her daytime job at the local grocery store, stocking shelves and bagging groceries with her mind elsewhere, Her coworkers noticed her distraction. "You feeling okay?" asked Rick, the kind-hearted store manager. "You look like you're a million miles away today." Lynn managed a weak smile. "Just tired. Didn't sleep well." She clocked out at 1 o'clock, giving herself plenty of time to catch the bus to the conservatory. On normal days, she wouldn't arrive until 4:30, but today wasn't normal. Professor Bennett's words echoed in her mind. 3 o'clock sharp. As the bus rumbled toward the conservatory, Lynn stared out the window, wondering if she should even go. What if it was some kind of trap to get her fired? Or worse, what if he expected her to play in front of other people? The very thought made her hands shake. She had never played for anyone before. The piano had always been her private comfort, a secret joy. The conservatory looked different in daylight. Instead of the quiet, empty halls she was used to cleaning, the building buzzed with activity. Students rushed between practice rooms, instrument cases in hand. Professors carried stacks of sheet music. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, a place they belonged. Everyone except Lynn. She felt painfully out of place in her simple street clothes, worn jeans and a faded blue sweater. She clutched her small handbag closer to her body as she navigated the unfamiliar daytime rhythm of the school, following the now familiar path to the main concert hall. As she approached, she heard voices from within, many voices talking and laughing. Lynn's steps slowed. She checked the time on her old wristwatch, 2:55 p.m. She was early, but clearly not the first to arrive. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy door and slipped inside. The concert hall was filled with people. At least 20 students sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle around the grand piano on stage. Most appeared to be in their 20s, dressed in the casual but expensive style that marked them as coming from privileged backgrounds. A few older people, visiting musicians perhaps, sat in the back row. And there, standing by the piano, was Professor Bennett. He was speaking animatedly to the group, gesturing with elegant hands. Today's masterclass will focus on the emotional interpretation of romantic era compositions. Technical precision is, of course, essential, but without emotional authenticity, you might as well be playing a mechanical piano roll. Lynn froze just inside the doorway, hoping to remain unnoticed. She considered turning around and leaving before anyone saw her. This was clearly a serious music class for serious musicians. Whatever the professor had planned, she didn't belong here. But before she could retreat, Professor Bennett looked up and spotted her. "Ah," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Our special guest has arrived." Every head in the room turned toward the door. Lynn felt her face grow hot under their curious stares. She stood rooted to the spot, unable to move forward or back. Come in," Professor Bennett beckoned. "Everyone I'd like you to meet." He paused, clearly having forgotten her name from their brief exchange the night before. "Lynn," she supplied quietly. "Lynn Wei." "Yes, Ms. Wei," he continued smoothly. "Come up to the front, please." Lynn walked slowly down the aisle, acutely aware of the whispers that followed her. She kept her eyes on the floor, counting steps to distract herself from the scrutiny. When she reached the stage, Professor Bennett gestured for her to stand beside him. He turned to address his students again. "Before we begin our planned program today, I want to share an interesting experience I had last night." His voice carried easily through the hall. "I returned to the conservatory after hours to retrieve some materials, and found Ms. Wei here, who, by the way, is a member of our cleaning staff playing this very piano." More whispers rippled through the audience. Lynn wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She stared at her worn sneakers, wishing she were invisible. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be grounds for immediate dismissal, the professor continued. "These instruments are valuable and meant for student and faculty use only." Lynn's heart sank. So this was why he'd called her here, to make an example of her, to publicly fire her. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "However," Professor Bennett went on, his voice taking on a theatrical quality, "what I found most interesting was not the rule-breaking, but rather what I heard." He turned to Lynn with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ms. Wei, how many years have you studied piano?" Lynn's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I haven't, sir." "Speak up, please," he prompted. "The class can't hear you." She cleared her throat. "I haven't studied piano." "Not formally." "Not formally," Professor Bennett repeated, raising his eyebrows at his students. "And yet when I discovered her last night, she was playing, or attempting to play, Debussy's Clair de Lune. By ear, she claims." A few students exchanged skeptical glances. One young man in the front row smirked and whispered something to his neighbor, who stifled a laugh. "I thought this presented us with an excellent teaching opportunity," Professor Bennett continued. "We often discuss the difference between technical training and natural musicality. Today we have the chance to observe this distinction firsthand." He gestured toward the piano bench. "Ms. Wei, would you please play something for us? Perhaps the Debussy piece I heard you attempting last night." Lynn felt the blood drain from her face. I can't," she stammered. "Not with everyone watching." "Nonsense," the professor insisted. "You were happy enough to play on this expensive instrument when you thought no one was listening. Surely you can demonstrate for us now." Lynn looked out at the sea of faces staring back at her. Most wore expressions of mild curiosity or barely concealed amusement. They were waiting for her to embarrass herself, to provide them with an entertaining story to share later. "Remember when Professor Bennett made the cleaning lady try to play piano?" "Please," she said quietly. "I should get to work. My shift starts soon." "I've already spoken with your supervisor," Professor Bennett informed her. "You have permission to participate in our class today." There was no escape. Lynn took a deep breath and slowly made her way to the piano bench. Her legs felt weak as she sat down, her hands trembling visibly as she raised them to the keys. The beautiful instrument that had brought her so much secret joy now loomed before her like an instrument of torture. She placed her fingers on the keys but couldn't remember a single note of any piece she'd ever played. Her mind was completely blank with fear. "We're waiting, Ms. Wei," Professor Bennett prompted from somewhere behind her. A few snickers came from the audience. Lynn heard a whispered comment. "Does she even know which end of the piano to sit at?" Another voice, "This is ridiculous. What a waste of our class time." Lynn closed her eyes, trying to block out the judgmental stares and unkind comments. She thought of her tiny apartment, of the evenings spent listening to classical music on her second-hand radio, of the peace she felt when playing in the empty concert hall. She thought of her mother, who had loved music and had always told Lynn she had a gift even though they could never afford lessons or a piano. Slowly, her fingers began to move. The opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the hall, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. It wasn't perfect. She missed notes here and there, and her timing wavered occasionally, but the haunting melody took shape beneath her fingers, flowing from some deep instinctive place within her. She forgot about the audience, forgot about Professor Bennett and his cruel test. There was only the music, speaking through her hands in a language more natural to her than words. The familiar calm settled over her as she played, the world narrowing to just this moment, just these notes. When she finished the first movement, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, holding onto the feeling before reality crashed back in. The concert hall was completely silent. No whispers, no shuffling of feet, no barely suppressed laughter. Lynn slowly opened her eyes and turned to face the room, bracing herself for mockery or criticism. Instead, she found the students staring at her with expressions ranging from surprise to confusion to grudging respect. Professor Bennett stood at the edge of the stage, his arms crossed, a calculating look on his face. "Well," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. "That was interesting." He turned to address the class. "What we've just witnessed is what happens when natural talent exists without proper training. Ms. Wei has clearly never been taught correct hand positioning, pedal technique, or dynamics. And yet—" He paused, looking at Lynn with narrowed eyes. "And yet, there is something there, something that many of you, despite years of expensive training, still lack." He gestured toward the students. "Raoul, you're working on the Beethoven Sonata for your recital, aren't you? Come up here and show Ms. Wei how it should be played." A tall young man with perfectly styled hair rose from his seat and approached the piano with confident strides. Lynn quickly stood and moved away, making room for him on the bench. As she stepped back, she caught his eye. There was no warmth there, only cold assessment and thinly veiled disdain. "Now," said Professor Bennett, "let us compare the technically correct with the instinctively felt." Raoul took his place at the piano with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. He adjusted the bench to his liking, positioned his hands with textbook precision, and began to play the same Beethoven piece Lynn had just finished. The difference was immediately apparent. His playing was technically flawless, each note perfectly timed, each dynamic shift executed with precision. His fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease, never faltering or hesitating. It was, by all academic standards, an excellent performance. But as Lynn listened, standing awkwardly to the side of the stage, she felt something was missing. The notes were all correct, the tempo consistent, yet the soul of the music, the mournful longing that had always spoken to her in this piece, seemed somehow absent. It was like looking at a perfect photograph of a sunset instead of witnessing the real thing. When Raoul finished, the class burst into appreciative applause. He stood and gave a small bow, a satisfied smile on his face. Professor Bennett nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Raoul. Excellent technique, as always." The professor turned to address the entire class. "Now, what differences did you observe between these two performances?" A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Ms. Wei's timing was inconsistent. The tempo dragged in several places. "True," Professor Bennett agreed. "What else?" "Her fingering was all wrong," offered another student. "And she hardly used the pedal at all." The professor nodded. "Valid observations." "Anyone else?" A quiet voice spoke from the back of the room. "She made me feel something." All heads turned to look at the speaker, an older man with silver-streaked hair whom Lynn didn't recognize. He must have been one of the visiting musicians. "Could you elaborate, Dr. Nakamura?" Professor Bennett asked, his tone more respectful than when addressing his students. The man leaned forward in his chair. "Technical precision is important, yes. But the purpose of music is to move the listener. Ms. Wei's performance, for all its technical flaws, had an emotional authenticity that I found quite affecting." A murmur ran through the room. Raoul's expression darkened slightly. "An interesting point," Professor Bennett conceded. "Though I wonder if what you're responding to is merely the novelty of hearing an untrained player. A sort of curiosity factor." Dr. Nakamura shook his head. "I've been listening to piano performances for over 40 years. What I heard transcends novelty." Lynn stood frozen, hardly breathing. No one had ever spoken about her playing before. She had never played for anyone until today. To hear this distinguished-looking man defend her music made her heart race. Professor Bennett seemed momentarily thrown off balance by this unexpected support. He quickly regained his composure. "Well, we could debate aesthetics all afternoon, but let's move on to something more challenging." He turned to Lynn with a calculating look. "Ms. Wei, you mentioned you learned pieces by ear. What else have you picked up during your time cleaning our hallways?" Lynn hesitated. "Sometimes I hear students playing Chopin." "Ah, Chopin." The professor's eyes lit up with what looked like mischievous anticipation. "Perhaps his Etude Opera 10, number 4? One of the most technically demanding pieces in the repertoire. Raoul has been working on it for months." Raoul straightened his back, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Lynn shook her head. "No, not that one. I don't think I've heard it." "Pity," said Professor Bennett, not bothering to hide his disappointment. "What about his Nocturne in E-flat major? Surely you've heard that one. It's quite popular among our intermediate students." Lynn nodded slowly. "Yes, I know that one." "Splendid." The professor gestured toward the piano. "Let's hear it then." Raoul stood up from the bench, shooting Lynn a cold glare as he made his way back to his seat. She returned to the piano, feeling slightly less terrified than before. The Nocturne was one of her favorites, a piece she had heard so often that she sometimes played it in her dreams. As she sat down, she became aware of Dr. Nakamura watching her intently from the back row. His presence gave her a small boost of confidence. Someone in this room believed in her music, even if no one else did. Lynn placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The Nocturne's gentle, flowing melody rose into the air like a beautiful question. Unlike the Moonlight Sonata, with its straightforward structure, this piece required more subtlety, a delicate balance between the dreamy right-hand melody and the supporting left-hand patterns. She closed her eyes, letting the music guide her fingers. There were moments when she struggled with the more intricate passages, having never been taught the finger techniques to navigate them smoothly. But what her playing lacked in polish, it made up for in feeling. Each phrase told a story, of longing, of quiet joy, of peaceful acceptance. When the final notes faded into silence, Lynn opened her eyes to find the entire room watching her with varying degrees of astonishment. Even Professor Bennett seemed momentarily at a loss for words. It was Dr. Nakamura who broke the silence, rising from his seat with a slow, deliberate applause. One by one, others joined in, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Not everyone applauded. Raoul and a few others sat with arms firmly crossed, expressions tight with disapproval. Professor Bennett cleared his throat, regaining control of the room. Yes, well, an interesting interpretation. Technically problematic in numerous ways, of course, but I suppose there's a certain raw quality to it. He turned to the class. This demonstrates an important point about talent versus training. Ms. Wei clearly has some natural affinity for the instrument, but without proper technique, she'll never progress beyond this primitive level of expression. Lin's brief moment of pride wilted under his dismissive assessment. She began to stand, assuming her uncomfortable demonstration was over. "Wait," Professor Bennett said, stopping her. "I have one more test for you." He walked to a shelf near the piano and retrieved a folder of sheet music. Selecting a page, he placed it on the piano's music stand. "Can you read music, Ms. Wei?" She stared at the page of black dots and lines, as incomprehensible to her as a foreign language. "No, sir, as I suspected." He tapped the sheet music. "This is Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, a relatively simple piece, structurally speaking, though it requires precision." He turned to the class. Bach is the ultimate test of technique. His music cannot hide behind emotional flourishes or pedal effects. Every note must be perfectly placed. Lin looked at the mysterious symbols on the page, feeling utterly lost. "I can't play from this," she said quietly. "Of course not," Professor Bennett agreed, a note of triumph in his voice. "And that's precisely my point. Without proper training and the ability to read music, you are severely limited. You can only play what you've happened to hear, and even then only approximate versions." Dr. Nakamura stood up again. "May I make a suggestion, Professor?" Professor Bennett nodded reluctantly. "Play the Bach piece for her once," the older musician proposed. "Let's see if she can learn by ear, as she claims." The professor looked like he wanted to refuse but was too aware of Dr. Nakamura's stature to do so openly. "Very well," he said stiffly, "though I doubt a single hearing will be sufficient for such a structured piece." He gestured for Lin to move, taking her place at the piano. With crisp, precise movements, he played Bach's Prelude, a flowing series of arpeggios that created a hypnotic, meditative effect. The piece lasted about 3 minutes, its gentle pattern repeating with subtle variations throughout. When he finished, he looked at Lin with skeptical eyes. "Well, do you think you can reproduce that?" Lin had listened intently, her mind automatically breaking the music into patterns and progressions. It wasn't like the emotional pieces she usually played. This was mathematical, structured, yet still beautiful in its ordered way. "I can try," she said. Several students exchanged doubtful glances as she returned to the piano bench. Professor Bennett moved aside, clearly expecting a failed attempt that would prove his point about the limitations of untrained talent. Lin took a deep breath and began to play. The opening arpeggios flowed from her fingers, not with the professor's mechanical precision, but with a careful attention to the pattern. She made mistakes, missing a few notes in the progression, occasionally playing a wrong chord, but the essence of the piece remained intact. The structured beauty of Bach emerged from her imperfect rendition, like sunlight filtering through leaves. As she continued, she settled into the pattern, her mistakes becoming fewer. By the final section, she had found the rhythm of the piece, bringing it to a gentle conclusion that, while not note perfect, captured the peaceful resolution of Bach's design. The silence that followed felt different this time, heavier, charged with something beyond surprise. It was the silence of beliefs being questioned, of assumptions being re-examined. Dr. Nakamura was the first to speak. "Remarkable," he said simply. Professor Bennett stood beside the piano, his composed facade showing cracks for the first time. He looked at Lin with an expression she couldn't quite read, part disbelief, part calculation, and something else. Something that might have been the reluctant stirring of respect. "How long have you worked here, Ms. Wei?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. "Almost 3 years," she replied. "And you've been playing our pianos all this time?" Lin looked down at her hands. "Not all the time. Just sometimes after everyone has left. The music helps me forget my troubles for a little while." Professor Bennett turned to the class, whose expressions now ranged from outright amazement to thoughtful consideration. "I believe," he said slowly, that today's lesson has taken an unexpected turn. We have witnessed something quite unusual. He looked at Lynn with new intensity. Ms. Wei, would you be willing to return for our next class? Lynn blinked in surprise. Return? You want me to come back? Yes, he said. I think there may be more to learn from this experiment. Before she could answer, Dr. Nakamura approached the stage. If I may, he said, addressing both Lynn and Professor Bennett, I have a different proposal. He looked directly at Lynn, his kind eyes meeting hers. Ms. Wei, I would like to speak with you privately after this class concludes. About your future. The conservatory cafe was nearly empty when Lynn sat down across from Dr. Nakamura. Most students had gone home for the day, leaving only a few scattered at distant tables. Lynn clutched her cup of tea, still trying to process everything that had happened in the concert hall. I'm sorry about Professor Bennett's behavior, Dr. Nakamura said, stirring his own tea thoughtfully. Theodore has always valued technical perfection above all else. It's how he was taught, and it's how he teaches. Lynn shook her head slightly. He was right about many things. I don't know the proper techniques. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes, Dr. Nakamura replied with a gentle smile. Even those of us who have been playing for 50 years. Lynn looked up in surprise. 50 years? The older man nodded. I gave my first recital when I was 7 years old. By 10, I was performing with orchestras. By 15, I was touring internationally. You're a concert pianist, Lynn said, suddenly understanding why the professor had shown such deference to him. I was, Dr. Nakamura corrected. Now I mostly teach and occasionally judge international competitions. He took a sip of his tea. But we're not here to talk about me. I'd like to hear your story, Lynn. How did you come to play the piano without ever taking lessons? Lynn stared into her cup, watching the tea leaves swirl at the bottom. She rarely spoke about her past, but something about Dr. Nakamura's kind eyes made her want to share the truth. My mother loved music, she began quietly. Back in China, before I was born, she played the piano at the local community center. Not professionally, just for joy. When we came to America, we had nothing. No piano, barely enough money for rent and food. Lynn paused, remembering. But she would take me to the public library every weekend. They had an old upright piano in the children's section. She would play for half an hour, whatever they allowed, and I would watch her fingers move over the keys. She always said I had a gift for music, that I could hear things others couldn't. She was right. Dr. Nakamura said simply. Lynn continued, her voice growing softer. When I was 12, she got sick, cancer. We had no insurance, no savings. She died within a year. Lynn's fingers tightened around her cup. After that, there was no more music. I dropped out of high school to work. There were bills to pay, and I was alone. I'm sorry, Dr. Nakamura said, his eyes filled with genuine compassion. Lynn shrugged slightly. Life is what it is. For many years, I didn't touch a piano. Couldn't even listen to music because it reminded me too much of her. Then 3 years ago, I got this job at the conservatory. The first night I was cleaning the practice rooms, I heard someone playing Chopin. It was so beautiful, I sat outside the door for an hour just listening. And eventually, you began to play yourself? Dr. Nakamura guessed. Lynn nodded. At first, just a few notes when no one was around. Then short pieces I remembered from childhood. Then things I heard the students practicing. The music! It helped me feel close to my mother again. She looked up, a flash of defiance in her eyes. I know I shouldn't have touched the pianos without permission. But I was always careful. I never damaged anything. I believe you, Dr. Nakamura assured her. He set down his cup and leaned forward slightly. Lynn, what you did today, learning that Bach piece after hearing it once, that's extraordinary. Your ability to play with such emotional depth without formal training is even more remarkable. Lynn looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. Professor Bennett didn't seem to think so. Professor Bennett was shocked, Dr. Nakamura countered. Trust me, I've known Theodore for 20 years. I've never seen him so thoroughly surprised. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Lynn, have you ever thought about studying music formally? A small, sad laugh escaped her lips. Of course. But that's impossible. Conservatory tuition costs more than I make in a year. Besides, I'm 36 years old. Too old to start. Nonsense, Dr. Nakamura said firmly. I've had students begin serious study in their 40s and 50s. As for tuition, he hesitated. There might be options. Lynn's heart beat a little faster, but she quickly suppressed the flicker of hope. Dreams were dangerous things, they only led to disappointment. I need to get back to work, she said, starting to stand. My supervisor will be wondering where I am. Wait. Dr. Nakamura reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. I'm in town for another 3 days, giving master classes at the conservatory. I'd like you to come to my hotel tomorrow evening. I'm staying at the Westbrook downtown. There's a piano in the lobby lounge. Lynn took the card hesitantly. Why? I want to play for you, he said. And I want to hear you play again without Professor Bennett's interference. Will you come? Say 7 o'clock? Lynn looked at the elegant business card in her hand. It seemed to represent a world so far from her own. A world of concert halls and international travel. Of music as a profession rather than a secret comfort. I don't know, she said honestly. Please consider it, Dr. Nakamura replied. Sometimes life offers unexpected opportunities. The brave thing is to say yes. Lynn's tiny apartment felt especially empty that night. She moved around the cramped space, warming leftover rice on the small stove, her mind still swirling with the events of the day. The old radio on her kitchen counter was silent. For once, she didn't want to listen to music. She was too full of it already, her fingers still feeling the echo of keys beneath them. After her simple dinner, she sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out a worn shoebox from underneath. Inside were the few precious mementos she had of her mother. A faded photograph, a jade pendant, a few handwritten letters, and a yellowed program from a community recital 25 years ago. Her mother's name was printed near the bottom, May Wei, piano. Lynn traced the words with her fingertip, wondering what her mother would say about today. Would she be proud? Would she encourage Lynn to meet with Dr. Nakamura tomorrow? What should I do, Mama? She whispered to the empty room. No answer came, of course. Lynn carefully returned the treasures to their box and slid it back under the bed. She had an early shift at the grocery store tomorrow, followed by her regular cleaning job at the conservatory. When would she even have time to go downtown to meet Dr. Nakamura? And yet, as she prepared for bed, his words kept returning to her. Sometimes life offers unexpected opportunities. The brave thing is to say yes. The following day passed in a blur. Lynn moved through her grocery store shift mechanically, bagging items and helping customers while her mind was elsewhere. When her supervisor asked if she was feeling all right, she blamed lack of sleep. At the conservatory, she kept her head down, hoping to avoid running into Professor Bennett or any of his students. The memory of standing on that stage, being scrutinized and judged, still made her stomach tighten with anxiety. As she mopped the floor in the east hallway, she heard someone approaching. Looking up, she was startled to see Raoul, the student who had played Beethoven after her in yesterday's class. His expression was guarded, almost hostile. So, he said without greeting, Dr. Nakamura seems quite taken with your time playing. Lynn said nothing, continuing to move her mop across the floor. He's a powerful man in the music world, Raoul continued. His endorsement can open doors, even for people who don't deserve them. Lynn stopped mopping and looked directly at him. I never asked for his attention. Maybe not, Raoul conceded. But you got it anyway. Do you know how hard some of us have worked to get noticed by someone like him? Years of practice. Thousands of dollars in lessons. Sacrificing everything for music. His voice hardened. And then you walk in, having never studied a day in your life, and suddenly you're special? Lynn felt a flare of anger. You think I haven't sacrificed? You think my life has been easy? Raoul seemed taken aback by her sudden intensity. He recovered quickly. That's not the point. The point is, this is our world. We've earned our place here. You're just trespassing. Before Lynn could respond, another voice joined the conversation. That's quite enough, Raoul. They both turned to see Professor Bennett approaching, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Sir? Raoul straightened. I heard what you were just doing, the professor interrupted coolly. And while I understand your frustration, it's beneath you to harass the cleaning staff. Please return to the practice room. Your recital is in 3 weeks and your Chopin still needs considerable work. Raoul's face flushed with embarrassment. With a final glance at Lynn, he turned and walked away. Professor Bennett watched him go, then turned to Lynn. Ms. Wei. Professor, she acknowledged, gripping her mop handle tightly. He seemed unusually uncomfortable, shifting his weight slightly as he spoke. I understand Dr. Nakamura has invited you to play for him this evening. Lynn was surprised. How did you know that? He mentioned it after class yesterday, Professor Bennett explained. He was quite insistent about your potential. Lynn didn't know how to respond to this, so she remained silent. The professor cleared his throat. I may have been hasty in my assessment yesterday. Coming from him, Lynn realized. This was as close to an apology as she was likely to get. Your performance of the Bach piece, in particular, was, he seemed to be searching for the right word, illuminating. While technically imperfect, your ability to grasp the structure after a single hearing was unusual. Thank you, Lynn said quietly. Professor Bennett straightened his jacket, regaining his composed demeanor. I've been teaching for 27 years, Ms. Wei. In that time, I've seen thousands of students. Most have adequate technical skills. Some have exceptional technical skills. Very few have what cannot be taught. He paused. You should meet with Dr. Nakamura this evening. Lynn was stunned. But my shift, I've already spoken with your supervisor, he said briskly. You're excused from the remainder of today's duties. Paid, of course. Lynn didn't know what to say. This was the last thing she had expected from the stern professor, who had seemed so determined to humiliate her just yesterday. Professor Bennett checked his watch. It's nearly 6. You should have time to go home and change before meeting Dr. Nakamura. He gave her a critical once-over. Do you have something appropriate to wear? Lynn thought of her sparse closet at home. Not really, the professor sighed. Wait here. He walked away, leaving Lynn standing bewildered in the hallway, her mop still in hand. 5 minutes later, he returned with a conservatory tote bag, which he handed to her. My daughter left this behind when she visited last month, he explained. It should be approximately your size. Lynn peered into the bag and saw a simple but elegant black dress. I can't accept, she began. It's a loan, not a gift, Professor Bennett interrupted. Return it when convenient. He took a step back. Now I suggest you hurry. Dr. Nakamura values punctuality. Lynn stood frozen, unable to process this unexpected turn of events. The professor raised an eyebrow. Well, what are you waiting for? Go. Why are you helping me? Lynn asked, finally finding her voice. Professor Bennett's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because talent deserves opportunity, Ms. Wei. Even I can recognize that. He gestured toward the exit. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. The Westbrook Hotel stood tall and elegant in the heart of downtown, its glass doors reflecting the golden glow of sunset. Lynn paused on the sidewalk outside, clutching her small handbag. The borrowed dress felt strange against her skin, soft, expensive fabric so different from her usual worn clothes. She had pinned her hair up as neatly as she could and applied a touch of her rarely used lipstick. Still, as business people and well-dressed hotel guests brushed past her, she felt painfully out of place. I shouldn't be here, she whispered to herself, taking a step back. But then she thought of her mother, of the shoebox of memories under her bed, of the sacrifices made so that Lynn could have a chance at a better life. What would Mei Wei say if she could see her daughter now, standing at the threshold of an opportunity she had never dared to dream of? Lynn took a deep breath and walked through the revolving door into the hotel's grand lobby. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Polished marble floors reflected the warm lighting. To her right, she spotted the lounge area where plush chairs and small tables surrounded a sleek black grand piano. And there, already seated near the piano, was Dr. Nakamura. He rose when he saw her, a warm smile lighting up his face. You came, he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. I'm so glad, Lynn managed a nervous smile in return. Professor Bennett gave me the evening off, did he? Dr. Nakamura looked surprised, then pleased. Well, Theodore continues to surprise me. Please sit down. Lynn perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, acutely aware of the other hotel guests chatting quietly at nearby tables. A server approached immediately. Would you like something to drink? Dr. Nakamura asked. Tea, perhaps? Lynn nodded. Just tea, thank you. After the server left, Dr. Nakamura gestured toward the piano. Beautiful instrument, isn't it? A Steinway Model B. Not quite as grand as the one at the conservatory, but with a lovely warm tone. Lynn looked at the gleaming piano with longing. It's beautiful, You'll play it soon, he promised. But first I'd like to talk about what happens next. Next? Lynn's heart fluttered nervously. Dr. Nakamura leaned forward slightly. Lynn, I've been teaching piano for over 30 years. In that time, I've encountered perhaps 3 students with your level of natural musicality. What you have cannot be taught. It's innate. A rare gift. He paused as their tea arrived, waiting until the server had gone before continuing. But gifts need nurturing. Raw talent needs refinement. You have extraordinary potential, but without training it will remain just that, potential. Lynn wrapped her hands around the warm teacup. Dr. Nakamura, I appreciate your kindness, but as I said yesterday, I can't afford lessons, let alone conservatory tuition. I understand that, he said gently. Which is why I've spent the day making some calls. Lynn looked up, confused. Calls? I serve on the board of the International Foundation for Musical Excellence, he explained. We provide scholarships to exceptional talents who lack financial resources. Typically, these go to younger students, but exceptions can be made in extraordinary cases. He smiled. I would consider your situation extraordinary. Lynn felt as if the floor beneath her was shifting. You mean a scholarship for me? Not just any scholarship, Dr. Nakamura continued. A full program. Tuition, living stipend, private instruction. He took a sip of his tea. I've already spoken with the board chairwoman. She's intrigued by my description of your abilities. All that remains is for her to hear you play. Hear me play? Lynn repeated weakly. Yes. She's flying in tomorrow specifically to meet you. We would arrange a private audition at the conservatory. He must have noticed the panic on her face because he quickly added, just the 3 of us. No audience, no pressure. Lynn set down her cup, her hand suddenly unsteady. I don't know what to say. It's too much. It's an opportunity, Dr. Nakamura corrected gently. One I believe you've earned through your talent and perseverance. But what if I'm not good enough? The fear that had been building inside her finally spilled out. What if I disappoint you? I've never had a lesson in my life. I make mistakes. I don't even read music. All of that can be taught, Dr. Nakamura assured her. What you have, the soul in your playing, the natural musicality, that cannot be taught. It comes from within. He gestured toward the piano. Why don't you play something now? Whatever you feel comfortable with. Lynn looked around the lounge nervously. Other hotel guests were engaged in quiet conversation, paying them little attention. But the idea of playing in this elegant space still terrified her. I don't know if I can, she whispered. Dr. Nakamura studied her thoughtfully. Let me play first then. Sometimes it helps to break the silence. He moved to the piano bench and settled himself with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime at keyboards. Without any sheet music, he began to play a piece. Lynn recognized immediately. Debussy's Clair de Lune, the very piece Professor Bennett had caught her attempting 2 nights ago. But Dr. Nakamura's playing was nothing like her own hesitant version. Under his hands, the music seemed to shimmer in the air, delicate and dreamlike. Each phrase flowed naturally into the next, creating a musical landscape of moonlight and gentle shadows. Lynn found herself leaning forward, drawn into the world he was creating through sound. When the final chord faded away, several hotel guests applauded softly. Dr. Nakamura acknowledged them with a small nod, then turned to Lynn. Now you, he said quietly, play whatever speaks to you. Perhaps it was the magic of his performance still hanging in the air, or perhaps it was simply time for Lynn to step beyond her fears. But she found herself rising from her chair and moving toward the piano. As she sat on the bench he had just vacated, feeling its lingering warmth, a strange calm settled over her. The elegant hotel, the watching guests, even Dr. Nakamura's hopeful presence, all seemed to fade into the background. There was only Lynn and the piano, ready to have a conversation. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Not Debussy or Beethoven or Chopin, not any piece she had overheard at the conservatory, but something else entirely. Simple chords at first, tentative and questioning. Then a melody emerged, one she had never played before, one that seemed to be creating itself under her fingers. It was her mother's song, not a piece Mei Wei had played, but the essence of Lynn's memories of her. The bright optimism of early childhood, the struggle of their early years in America, the pain of loss, and finally, the quiet resilience that had sustained Lynn through the lonely years that followed. All of it flowed through her hands onto the keys, an improvised story told in music. She played for several minutes, lost in the creation of something deeply personal yet universal. When she finally brought the piece to a gentle close, she was surprised to feel tears on her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed, before turning to face Dr. Nakamura. His expression stopped her apology before it could form. He was looking at her with something like wonder. He seemed at a loss for words, unusual for the eloquent musician. "Lynn, what piece was that? I'm not familiar with it." "It wasn't a piece," she admitted. "I was just playing what I felt." "You composed that? Just now?" His eyebrows rose in astonishment. Lynn shrugged slightly. "I suppose so. I was thinking about my mother." Dr. Nakamura shook his head slowly. "Extraordinary. Not just a natural performer, but a composer as well." He smiled broadly. "The scholarship is just the beginning, Lynn. With the right training, the right opportunities, there are no limits to what you might achieve." For the first time, Lynn allowed herself to truly believe him, to imagine a future different from the one she had resigned herself to. A future filled with music, with growth, with possibility. The next afternoon found Lynn once again in the conservatory's main concert hall, but everything felt different. This time she entered through the front doors, not the service entrance. This time she wore Professor Bennett's daughter's borrowed dress, not her cleaner's uniform. This time she walked with her head high, not hunched against the world. The hall was empty except for 3 people: Lynn, Dr. Nakamura, and an elegant woman he introduced as Ms. Vivian Shu, the chairwoman of the International Foundation for Musical Excellence. "Dr. Nakamura has told me remarkable things about you, Ms. Wei," Ms. Shu said, her keen eyes appraising Lynn. "I rarely make special trips for auditions, but he was quite insistent that I needed to hear you play in person." "Thank you for coming," Lynn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm honored." "Don't thank me yet," Ms. Shu replied with a small smile. "I have high standards. Shall we begin?" Lynn nodded and moved toward the piano, the same magnificent instrument she had secretly played for 3 years, the one where her life had changed 2 nights ago. As she adjusted the bench, the door at the back of the hall opened quietly. Professor Bennett slipped in and took a seat in the last row. He gave Lynn a small nod of encouragement when she caught his eye. "Whenever you're ready," Dr. Nakamura said gently. "Play whatever you wish." Lynn placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece she had performed in yesterday's class. But this time there was no fear, no hesitation. She played with quiet confidence, letting the music speak through her. When she finished, Ms. Shu's expression remained carefully neutral. Impressive for someone with no formal training. Perhaps something more technically challenging now? Lynn thought for a moment, then began Bach's Prelude in C major, the piece Professor Bennett had challenged her with. She played it from memory, more smoothly than the day before, having replayed it in her mind throughout the night. Ms. Shu nodded approvingly but still showed no strong reaction. "And finally, Ms. Wei, would you play something of your own? Dr. Nakamura mentioned you composed a piece yesterday evening." Lynn hesitated. Improvising in the moment was one thing. Recreating that spontaneous composition was another challenge entirely. "Just play what's in your heart," Dr. Nakamura encouraged. Lynn took a deep breath and began. The melody was different from the previous night's improvisation, yet it carried the same emotional truth. This time she played not just about her past but about her possible future. The fear and hope intertwining, the sense of standing at a crossroads. The music built slowly, questioning at first, then growing in confidence until it reached a moment of decision, of acceptance, before resolving into peaceful determination. When the final notes faded, Lynn looked up to find Ms. Shu leaning forward in her seat, her composed facade finally broken. "Well," she said softly, "Dr. Nakamura was right." 1 year later, the conservatory's annual gala concert was the highlight of the school's calendar. The Grand Hall was filled to capacity with students, faculty, donors, and music lovers from throughout the city. The program featured the school's most promising talents, each performing a short piece to showcase their progress. Backstage, Lynn smoothed the skirt of her new dress, one she had purchased herself, not borrowed. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the sheet music one last time. After a year of intensive study, She could now read the notes as easily as words, though she still preferred playing from memory. Nervous? Professor Bennett appeared beside her, looking unusually approachable in his formal concert attire. A little, Lynn admitted. I never thought I'd be here performing rather than cleaning up afterward. The professor's expression softened. You've worked harder than any student I've ever taught. Your progress this year has been nothing short of remarkable. It was true. The scholarship had changed everything. Lynn had left her cleaning and grocery jobs to focus full-time on music. She had started with the basics that most students learned as children: reading music, proper technique, music theory. The foundation had even arranged for her to have a small upright piano in her new apartment, where she practiced 6 to 8 hours every day. The learning curve had been steep and sometimes painful. There had been moments of frustration, of self-doubt, of wondering if she had started too late. But through it all there had been the music, her constant companion, her solace, her joy. Ms. Wei, a stagehand called. You're on in 5 minutes. Lynn nodded, her heartbeat quickening. Your mother would be proud, Professor Bennett said quietly. Lynn looked at him in surprise. In their year of working together, he had never mentioned her mother. Dr. Nakamura told me your story, he explained, about how she introduced you to music, how you lost her too young. He hesitated, then added, My own mother was a pianist. She never achieved professional success, but her love of music shaped my life. I sometimes forget that technical excellence isn't the only measure of musical worth. Lynn was touched by this rare personal revelation from her usually reserved teacher. Thank you, Professor. Now, he said, returning to his more familiar brisk tone. Remember what we practiced. Take your time with the opening and don't rush the cadenza. Lynn smiled. Some things never changed. When her name was announced, Lynn walked onto the stage with confidence she couldn't have imagined a year ago. The spotlight felt warm on her skin as she bowed to the audience, then settled at the piano. In the front row sat Dr. Nakamura and Ms. Shu, both beaming with pride. Behind them, scattered throughout the hall, were Lynn's fellow students, including Raoul, who had eventually come to respect her dedication, if not quite befriend her. But Lynn wasn't playing for any of them. As her fingers touched the keys and the first notes of her own composition filled the hall, she played for the memory of a woman who had once made music in a small community center in China, who had played on a library piano for her daughter on weekend afternoons, whose love had planted the seeds of something beautiful that was only now, years later, coming into full bloom, and somewhere, Lynn believed her mother was listening.